Welcome to part 8 of this series on how to understand the Bible. In today's segment, we're going to be starting a look at the book of Genesis, a most fascinating book.
It really is.
And I have to confess that this week I've had to give up some cherished opinions. And I've seen some things that I've been looking right past for the last 40 years. So that's okay. If you're not seeing something that you haven't seen before, then you might be wasting your time. And I don't think I've wasted my time this week, Annali.
Good.
It's a fascinating book, the book of Genesis, when we stop and say, I wonder who its first audience was.
Yeah, like often we, if we're just sort of doing a quick read through, we sort of assume it was just written in this sequence and this was the first one and just moving along that way. Whereas there's some really clear evidence that it might not necessarily have been quite that straightforward.
That it had a purpose, as we've talked about in the past. It had some people that it was actually written to. And it almost looks like it was written and then reapplied to a second group of people.
And you've got evidence of kind of almost an editorial process that, there's original sources clearly used, but that there is editorial added later for later audiences.
And we can see that.
We've got in Genesis 12:6, just this slight throwaway line at the end of the verse that just says, at that time the Canaanites were in the land, which kind of implies that the audience he's talking to, the Canaanites are no longer in the land. Like, you don't add that detail if the Canaanites are still in the land. It's, so it's implying that whoever was editing it at this point just sort of added a note for reference that at that time the Canaanites were in the land.
Which they were when Moses was writing. It seemed surplus to put it there.
But in the context, putting this context in, it sort of suggests that at least one of these editorials happens after the Canaanites are no longer in the land, which is much later on.
And there's this other one a little bit further on in the book. These are the kings who reigned in the land of Edom before any king reigned over the Israelites.
Which is, again, implying that, the author now has knowledge that at some point the Israelites have kings, but they don't yet.
And we look at that and say, well, what do we do with that? And then we've got a whole lot of what we call glosses, which actually give us sort of a two-time period. The king of Bela, that is Zoar. And all of these joined forces in the valley of Sidon, that is the Salt Sea.
So there's kind of this recognition that some of the place names have changed and, in the original account, it was called this, but they've added but now you know it as this place, just to kind of make that connection.
Yeah, and you got again verse 7, verse 15, verse 16, then they turned back and came to En Mishpat, that is Kadesh. And we look and say, well, hang on, what do we make of this? Well, what we actually have there is the old and the original names. And then an editor has said, well, that doesn't make sense to my audience, and has said, we need just to stick a little bit more in so that the modern audience...
A little bit like some of, when we were talking about translations and such, some of the New Testament writers or some of the translation stations, they would add small amounts of commentary or explanation for an audience that didn't understand.
So Luke for the Greeks, Mark for the Romans said, look, we need to put in a little bit of
extra information.
And I'm going to suggest that here the audience might not be different in nationality, but different in time period. That we have a book brought together by Moses and then brought up to speaking to his time by someone later, after there were kings and after there weren't Canaanites.
One of the key suggestions about that is it could be post-exile, that, sort of around about the time of Ezra, because, that fits the scenario of, once after there had been kings, after the Canaanites were in the land, some of these kind of details. But both in the Exodus and the exile, you have a nation brought out of like exile, of slavery, and the stories of their people and who they were, how they had come to be this, the stories of their God haven't been the stories they're surrounded by in that time. So both post-exile and post-Exodus, you've got kind of a nation having to sort of gather all its stories together and learn who they are again.
I want you to listen to that really carefully so that no one says Ken and Annali believe that Genesis was written post-exile. It's not what we're saying. We're saying here is a book that was written for people at the time of the Exodus because of their special needs. And I wonder if there was actually campfire stories when Moses had story time.
Quite possibly.
And
even looking at some of the particular rules and regulations that come up a little bit later on, like in Leviticus and stuff. Again, you've kind of got evidence of brick by brick rebuilding what it is to live as a society, what it is to function together, what it is to have, the Hebrew God as their God. It's just sort of brick by brick reconstructing their nation.
And it happened.
Right, just pause it. Nation by nation. And just need to get your microphone into your collar. Now, if you switch that mic around to the opposite, just squeeze it and turn it around. Oh, there you go. So yes, that's inside there.
Let's try that.
Yep.
Yeah, where were we up to?
Rebuilding the nation, basically.
So here we have a book that was used at the time of the Exodus. In fact, it leads up. We wouldn't need an Exodus if there hadn't been what do you call an Exodus? The story of Joseph and how they went to Egypt. Genesis sets the scene for the book of Exodus, where they come out and after being slaves, they have to learn all over again. And after the exile, they have to learn all over again. And here with these glosses, we see a later editor saying, well, look, this needs to make sense for the people of my day and age. And so suddenly Sarah dies at Kiriath Arba. That is Hebron. Rachel died. She was buried on the way to Ephraim. Oh, that's Bethlehem. So it's been fascinating looking at this, and also some of the internal evidence that Moses had accessible to him, some documentation of the patriarchs.
And then, fast forwarding to later on post-exile, you've got in Ezra the reading of the books where the people come together to hear the law of the Lord. And this is clearly sort of fairly new information to them, that for all this time they've been surrounded by, Babylonian ideas and myths and legends, and you've got this bringing out of the books, so that there's been an effort to preserve, the writings and the law. And at this point, they're kind of bringing them all back out and getting them back into circulation again.
So a book that's meeting the needs of those two generations, but also speaks to the needs of our generation. Because for each of them, the question was, where did we come from? What's our story? And here's a book that's going to answer that for them and for us as well. But maybe it's helpful to go back and to look and say, well, what was the milieu that they grew up in? Abraham came from Ur of the Chaldees. What was the situation back where he came from? The Israelites were slaves in Egypt. What was going on there? What other ideas were floating around at the time?
Because often, if we're taking this kind of almost as in a vacuum, we're not seeing some of the places where this is directly responding to things around them. Like we can see it a little bit more in some of the writings of Paul, where, he says, don't be doing this, which kind of gives us an indication that the church was doing that. But sometimes, particularly for the Old Testament, it's a lot harder to see how the book itself is addressing current and, addressing what's happening around it.
Mm-hmm. So what was the situation and what did these books mean in the context of the original audiences for whom they were written? Way back at the time of Abraham, the people over in the Ur of the Chaldees, the Babylonian area, had what's been known as the Enuma Elish, and this was then copied, and copies were found up at Nineveh. In fact, they found one copy, got it back to London, read it, and at the bottom there was a colophon. Now, a colophon's where the scribe writes down, copied by, and this is tablet 1 of 7. And they said, you better go back and find the other 6. And he was sent back to Nineveh, and he came back with the other 6 by some miracle. And it turns out to be the Babylonian flood story. And it's got a whole lot of similarities to the book of Genesis, which maybe shouldn't surprise us if it's the same story. The story begins with a watery chaos, with a primeval darkness covering everything. And then light is created to replace the darkness. The heavens are made and the heavenly bodies are placed in them. Man is created. I can hear some echoes there.
And there's some really interesting similarities, but sometimes what we see comes more from the differences.
Yeah.
Because when we're looking at, this sort of as a creation story, particularly looking at some of the context, this is some of the stories they've been surrounded by, but the Hebrew story is much, much different. You've got a lot of similar details, but what is different is key. Because for example, in the creation, you've got a lot of conflict, whereas God just sort of comes straight down and does it. We've got, at the end of the week in the Babylonian, at the end of the creation process in the Babylonian epic, you've got Marduk making the humans to be slaves to the god so the gods can rest. Whereas in the Hebrew version, you've got God making the people and then resting with them, which, is a really significant difference in terms of just your understanding of God and your picture of God.
So picture of God
is huge.
In the book of Genesis.
Particularly when we're making those comparisons to some of the other, because there are quite a lot of places that have creation stories that have really distinct similarities. But the picture of God is almost always where those differences are.
And just looking at the Enuma Elish, we've got here a dysfunctional pantheon of gods. They are killing each other and then making something out of the god that they've just killed. At the moment you've got multiple gods, you've got problems. And the stark contrast between this and the monotheism of the biblical account.
And even just some of the details, in the beginning, in the Genesis account, you've got there's the chaos. And this chaos and the darkness and the emptiness is very much kind of almost has echoes of some of these ideas that you've got, these gods of chaos, the gods of the water, and you have God hovering over them. Now it's a feminine verb. It's very much kind of almost a brooding, a hovering, like a hen waiting to give birth kind of thing, which again is a very different picture of God to them kind of fighting it out and killing each other and stuff
Intrigues
happening.
and conspiracies.
And you've got God kind of hemming that chaos in, as opposed to, the chaos that is just allowed to happen with all the other gods. You've got a little bit later on when God says, let the water teem with living creatures, let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the sky. So God created the great creatures of the sea. Now, the word here is kind of the one used in Canaanite mythology, particularly to, basically the monsters of the deep. So here you've got God making the monsters of the deep and calling them good, which is kind of a bit of a wait, what kind of moment for them? Because the monsters of the deep are kind of, in Old Testament poetry, sort of they're the boogeyman, the monsters, the antithesis kind of, you've got God and you've got the monsters of the deep. Mm-hmm. And here you have God as the creator of them, and sort of, they're good, they're given a purpose. And that kind of gives us a really different picture of God.
In the Babylonian story, their gods really are the monsters of the deep. Some of them anyway. And
so, the Hebrew story starts with God hovering above that. Mm-hmm. About him, him when he's creating the earth, he hems the chaos in. Like there's a control. It's the enemy isn't eliminated, because if you need to eliminate that, what makes you afraid, it's kind of a lack of relationship and a lack of trust in God that he can control that. You can trust that relationship. Mm-hmm. That if he removed it all, it would be a very different thing to saying it has a place, but it's controlled. It can only go so far.
And the Babylonian gods were part of nature, whereas in Genesis, God is distinct from and above and beyond nature. He's the creator of it, not part of it.
Whereas in the Babylonian, there's kind of these generations of gods, in that, the water god kind of beget the earth god, beget that you've sort of got these generations and they're squabbling and fighting and it comes together in the end, but, it's kind of none of these gods are enough on their own.
But actually you can't have multiple gods and have an all-powerful God. And this is where I think Genesis is going to be different. That God is actually all-powerful because he's the only one. He's not fighting with every other deity because there is no God besides him.
And if you're looking at a people coming out of slavery, a people coming out of exile, kind of, what kind of God do we serve? What kind of a God do we have a covenant relationship with? And these are the stories that tell them why their God is different to all the other gods in the culture surrounding them.
And our God is the same as their God. In Egypt, the people would also have been exposed to the Egyptian deities. And they had a whole menagerie of gods. Frogs and lions, they were morphing between them. But they basically had a story where the world had arisen out of lifeless waters of chaos.
Which does sound a little familiar.
Again, they're starting in the same place, and then a mound of earth arises out of the water. You say, oh, that's sounding familiar.
Following the same pattern.
And then the sun pops out of that, and then the gods are backwards and forwards. But it's chaos. Multiple gods again.
And so if you've got a people coming out of, Exodus, coming out of exile, these are the ideas they've been surrounded by for a generation or two at least. And so, that you've got these accounts in Genesis kind of reintroducing them back to their family, to their history, to their God.
And we can see why the book of Genesis needed to go along with the book of Exodus. And when we come to the Genesis account, stylistically, it's actually quite different. It's not couched in the language of mythology and this god and that god.
And particularly sort of the heroes and the epics. These are kind of, grand stories that are woven to be impressive, and the concept of the hero is a big one. Like, a lot of them will talk about, the gods with the human heroes, and the gods sort of, tolerate the humans, but it's the human heroes that are the kind of anchors almost. Whereas in this story, God is the hero always.
And that's where it begins. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth.
And I think there's some interesting details here in that, it says in the beginning. We don't, there's no indication of when in the beginning was. Apparently we don't need to know that. That's not important. Just, there was a beginning, and in that beginning God created. We also don't know how much space has elapsed between God created the heavens and the earth and God starting to actually, do this act of creation. We just don't know. There's no information.
So, in the beginning.
Whenever that was.
It's almost like John, in the beginning. Whenever the beginning was, God created the heavens and the earth. And when he did, the earth was?
Empty, chaos.
It was chaos. It was formless. There was nothing there.
And, we do have some evidence to suggest that it could have stayed in that state for quite a while before God actually started doing the, let there be light and putting some more work into the planet.
So here we've got the planet, we've got water swirling around it. Could that lay down sediment?
You would assume so.
I would suppose it would. Would there be life in that sediment? Life hasn't come along yet. And look, I just find it intriguing. I read a little bit. The bottom layers, the Precambrian, have no life in them. And they are probably some of the biggest layers that there are. It's the base of everything.
Just when it was spending time slushing around, nothing happening yet.
And we think, well, was erosion happening at that time? Well, did the laws of physics not apply until life came along?
There's a lot of questions we don't actually have specific answers to, though.
And how long was it empty for? Like, if it was only momentary, it's hardly worth mentioning.
Whereas if it's been empty for a while, like, you've almost got this, like in Daniel, the sort of, that's not information you need to know, just go your way. This is just like, you need to know there was a beginning, God was in the beginning, he made everything, let's get into business.
And so God said, and it was. Day one had an evening and a morning. And God simply separated light and darkness. Day two, God says, well, we better have some atmosphere. And there was. Day three, well, I suppose if we got water, we better have some dry land.
Yes. And one of the interesting parallels that, if you're really looking at it, you can see is the first 3 days God spends making a space. Like, the day one, let there be light. So you've got making the space between, light and dark. When we get to day 4, God is filling that space.
Okay, so at the end of day one, we've got light, but it's still empty. At the end of day 2, we've got water.
And sky.
And sky, that's still empty. End of day 3, we've got water and sky and land. And
at the end
trees.
Of the day, yes.
And trees.
And trees.
Which are going to need some bees fairly shortly.
Yes.
But it's interesting. I wonder if they actually came with fruit. Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed and fruit trees bearing fruit after their kind with seed. And did they show up with fruit?
I would imagine so, because, we've got 3 days later, God creating humans. And by this time, there really has to be some kind of nourishment to sustain them. So, you kind of can't just plant little saplings and, when they get bigger, there'll be food.
Oh, okay. So we really can't make creatures until there's some fodder.
So there's a very logical, ordered way in which this is made. But again, you've got, day 1 making the space. Day 4, that space is filled. You've got the greater light, the lesser light, the stars.
In fact, it's interesting, given the Egyptian context. This God makes the sun, which the Egyptians are worshipping.
You've almost kind of got a my God's bigger than your God kind of feel to it almost.
Oh, so that's part of this story, is the power and the wisdom.
And you're kind of very much orienting God above all the other gods. That, yes, you've got the Egyptians have the god of the sun and the god of the Nile, but God is the one who made the sun and the Nile. And, you've kind of got this absolute trump card of, all these other gods do this, but this God is the God who made all those things.
And it's interesting in day 4, he makes the sun and the moon rule the day and the night. And then it's almost an afterthought. He made the stars. He also made the stars. That it's the same God. It's almost a throwaway. Yeah, he made the stars too, but the focus really has been on the sun and the moon.
And again, we've got, in day 2, God's created the space, the water, the atmosphere. In day 5, the fish, the monsters of the sea, the birds, you've got this making a space and filling it up.
So suddenly on day 5, we've filled day 2. And then on day 6, we go to dry land.
And that gets filled, the creatures, the humans. And, then we arrive at the point which is very different for the Hebrew account to all the rest. In the Babylonian account, you've got Marduk, who kind of makes the humans to be slaves to the gods so that the gods can rest, which is a very, very different account.
And that's going to, when we come to sacrifice, make a huge difference. The god is hungry, therefore we have to sacrifice to feed the gods.
And, you never know what mood God's going to be in today, and you better hope it's a good one, but we'll dump a little bit extra on the sacrifice just to make sure, we have to keep the God happy.
And this is a contrast to Genesis, where God himself will provide the sacrifice. And
I think, if you're coming out of a context of these are the stories you've been surrounded with, and this is, you hear this is going to be good news.
It's radical.
Particularly, if you're talking about an oppressed people, like people who've been in slavery, people who've been in exile, a lot of, the original audience that this was written about or to were in oppression in some way.
And probably religion had been used to keep them in oppression. This is what the gods made you for, was to be just like this. And suddenly we have God creating them. Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the sky. Basically, God gives the man and the woman co-dominion over that they're actually made in God's image.
Which is, again, I think one of the things, Islam, again, has a 6-day creation. But at the end of that, as best I can tell, God then just sort of ascends onto his throne and sort of sits there as the great all-powerful one. Whereas here you've got God making humans and giving them agency, giving them independence, giving them dominion and responsibility that that agency makes a big difference. Because if you've got God as, particularly when we get to the fall, because if you haven't given the humans any agency, then the fall can't really happen that way. You've got to explain it a different way, because if the humans are just being slaves to the gods and the humans screw up, well, it's kind of the gods' fault, because they should have, looked after their slaves better or something. If you've got, God just sort of not giving them that dominion but sort of stepping back up in his throne, again, they don't have the capacity to make that kind of a...
So God creates them with an intent to be relational. And as we come to the final day of creation week, God comes to them and says, well, you haven't done anything yet, why don't we have a day off?
Which is so radically different to all of the other gods they've been surrounded by.
And it's the order that later on will be the gospel order. That it's not what we have done, but it's the relationship of the time that we actually take with God. And yes, there's work that will be done, but it follows after the relationship. It's not the basis of the relationship.
And you've got God already having invested a lot of time and thought into building this place and these people, but sort of, creating for them. That it's not just a kind of an afterthought of, what, we need some people to do the work for us, let's just kind of make some people. That there's this pouring of love and attention into these people. And, if you've come out of a situation where you've been told you're less than, you're nothing, you're slaves, you're worthless, then this is really, really key in terms of them coming to understand who they are as God's people and why it is that he's calling them to live differently.
And that's probably still an important point today, that we're not nothing, we're not useless, we're actually made in the image of God, we have dignity and value, and we should treat each other that way. And so the first chapter through to about verse 4 of chapter 2, you've got a little phrase that comes up there. These are the generations of the earth when it was created. And that's the phrase that was new to me this week. It just occurs over and over at the end of a storyline. It's almost like the scribe saying, this was the story of. And then we move into the story that focuses more on the creation of man and woman. And the fall and their children. And then it's got that same thing. These are the generations of Adam. This is Adam's tablet. Comes down to us from there. And it focuses on what happens to Adam and Eve. To the fall. And it's probably something that as we're thinking about Genesis, we need to ask ourselves, what went wrong?
And I think, this is kind of a very key story to the entire rest of the Bible, because it sort of explains, where did sin come from, what went wrong, what broke this relationship with God initially.
And they've had this really generous God putting them on the throne, really, giving them dominion, saying, look, this is yours and you need to look after it and to protect it. And there's not very many conditions around here, apart from don't eat that.
And some of the other traditions have some degree of, don't eat that. But you can't really quite have the fall in this format unless you have, them having agency and dominion. You can't have this scenario without them having a relationship with God. Like you've got some of the other account, like the Zoroastrian. You've got humans created with the ability to sort of do good and resist, but they've got to work actively at it. They can't, if they don't work proactively at trying to resist evil and do good, then, they'll fail and the gods will be upset with them. That a lot of, each of them still has to deal with this issue, but none of them can really deal with it this way unless you have agency and you have a relationship with God. You can't have this without that.
And so it becomes a question of trust. And God's entrusted them with all this. And at the first hurdle, they drop it. They doubt what God says. The serpent says, did God really say? God knows that you'll be better off. You'll be like gods, you'll know good and evil, as if that was a good thing to know.
And I think that's one of the things because, in terms of spoiler alert, at that point they discovered, they'd only known good till that point. Mm-hmm. He wasn't entirely lying because, up until that point they didn't know what evil was. Then they found out what evil was and it wasn't really all it was cracked up to be. But, he wasn't entirely lying in that. But just sort of, the way he was kind of making the truth misleading.
And being made in the image of God, you'll be like God. They already were.
Yes.
And suddenly they doubted God and their world turned to quicksand.
And once again, you've got to have that trust and that relationship with God for this to work. Mm-hmm. And without it there, they're just silly humans. Of course, they're going to make stupid mistakes. But even after they've made the mistake, the way God works with them in relationship, he gets in there and starts cleaning up
and restoring that trust. It's interesting when we come to the New Testament, trust. Well, we call it a different name. We call it faith, but it's the same thing. It's trust. Seems to be the key thing that God's looking for in people. And when Adam and Eve screw up, and we're all in it now, God comes and promises to remedy the mess that they've made. The mess that human disobedience and distrust has caused. It's not like he's going to walk away and leave them on their own. And
which a lot of the other gods of the time would do.
Mm-hmm. In fact, when we look at a couple of these other accounts, in the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian account, the gods are annoyed by the constant disturbance from the humans. The humans are a noisy lot. Mm-hmm. And decided that they were going to wipe them out by surprise.
Except for one of the was it a spirit?
One of the gods broke ranks and warned one of the humans and said, "You better build yourself a boat." But what a capricious lot of gods. If they had just, we've had enough of this lot. And then it occurred to them that wasn't the smartest thing they'd done that day, because who was going to do all the work if they killed all the humans? Mm-hmm. And who was going to make the sacrifices and feed them? So we've got gods that are not real smart, not real wise, not forward-looking.
You've got a lot of details that are similar. Like in the Babylonian, one of the Babylonian tablets, you've got, wanting to build a boat, load it with animals and supplies. The boat rested on a mountain. They sent a dove and a swallow and they both came back, but the crow didn't return, and one of the gods was really grumpy that the humans survived and then just kind of, got over it essentially. But you've got quite a lot of cultures that have these, accounts of the flood. There's even an Aboriginal, there's a couple, but particularly one, the Warumba, or the Dreamtime flood. You've got the Ark, which is the Gumana, probably butchering pronunciation, my apologies. But, carrying Noah and the Aborigines, and it came to rest, in a southern floodplain. That you've got from Egypt, from the Greek mythology, Norse mythology, Aztec, Nigeria, Chinese, you've just got hundreds and hundreds of these flood narratives that all have kind of some sort of similar details, a God intervening and encouraging them to build a boat. Now, some of them, I think it's the Hindu one.
Manu.
His king showed I'm really paraphrasing here, but the king showed kindness to a fish who grew and grew and turned out to be a god. And the god warned him that, in 7 days there's going to be a flood. Suggested he build a big boat, took 7 sages, 4 worlds, all seeds, and 1 animal of every type. Afterwards, they tied the boat to the godfish with the serpent, and the godfish delivered them. So you've kind of got slight parallels. I'm not entirely sure how they were supposed to repopulate the earth with one animal of every type, but details, I guess. But you've got so many different flood narratives that have just sort of little similarities, but that, when you get back to the picture of God, this one is different.
The picture of God is different. I'm just looking at the Egyptian account also, that when Re became old, the deities tried to take advantage of his senility. Just pictures of God.
Yes.
Even humans plotted against him, which led to their fall from divine grace. In reaction to the rebellion, Re sent his eye to slaughter the rebels. They managed to work around it, but again, picture of God.
And again, there is an Egyptian account of the flood. We have enough details to know that's what it was, but the papyrus is really damaged, so we don't quite know what happened.
Which brings us to the next major segment in the first part of Genesis. The world-changing event of
The flood.
I guess we could say God decided that the world had got to the point where we needed to press the reset button. The population is exploding. God looks and sees the wickedness of men is great. Everything they think about is only evil all the time.
But I think one of the key verses is Genesis 6, chapter 6, verse 6. The Lord was grieved that he had made man on the earth, and his heart was filled with pain. This isn't angry, wipe them out. This is pain. And that is a very, very different picture.
So this is a God with tears in his eyes at what he had made and said, it's really good.
And what that had become.
To the point where, in order to rescue the situation, it was going to have to be reset. It was going to have to be major.
And you've almost got, you've got echoes of flood language used much further on in the Bible when, he's talking about, creating a new heavens and a new earth. There's some of this terminology and this language and this imagery being used, and that, it got to the point where it had to be dealt with.
And some of the later prophets, it could be Zephaniah, actually uses flood language, I will wash away. And it's also interesting how many times the divine rescues came through water. The Exodus and a new start. But with this, God's decided what he's going to do. He allows 120 years of opportunity. And it's one of the things I've observed is that he's not capricious. There will be advance notice. If you keep going the way you're going, this is what's going to happen. And along with the warning, there is also opportunity, there's a way of escape.
Which I also think, looking at some of the other accounts, a lot of them, they got like a week's warning. Like in a week, the world is going to be destroyed with a flood, go build. Like building a boat of any size in a week is a massive undertaking, whereas if you've got 120 years.
You've got a visual aid. If you need a visual aid, Noah had a visual aid, a talking point.
Very much a talking point, and you can bet that the gossip circles had this crazy, because up until this time there hadn't really been rain. Like, people didn't know what rain was. The idea of, water coming from the sky and flooding the place was utterly absurd.
It's intriguing to wonder if people had listened to Noah, whether God would have changed his mind about the flood.
And I mean, just even say, looking at the story of Jonah, God comes in going, there's going to be destruction, and Jonah sort of, heads back, sitting waiting for the destruction because, God said there would be, whereas the people have kind of gone, whoops, we got it wrong, have done an about face, and the destruction doesn't happen.
And suddenly the heathen were more in harmony with the God of heaven than the prophet was.
Yes. But I think you've also got this really key element of the relationship between God and his people here, because, you have some of the other gods providing ways of escape. But this seems to be really the only account where at the end of that you have God making a covenant with his people. I will not destroy the earth this way again.
And that's said multiple times. I will establish this is verse 18 of chapter 6. I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall enter the ark, you and your sons. And so Noah did all that God commanded, because God said, I will do it.
And once again, this is happening within the context of a relationship. It's not just kind of, he's slightly less evil than the rest, we'll kind of, keep him safe. It's an intimate relationship. And that covenant is, again, like, these are some of the key stories that really inform the Hebrew thinking, like the creation, you've got the fall, but also with the fall, that promise that was going to come a Messiah. Mm-hmm. And that is something that's really key through each of the generations. Will this be the generation? Will my child be the Messiah? You've got this covenant with Noah. And again, that covenant is a theme and a relationship that just follows through all the way.
And the whole flood story is almost a judgment story. And judgment with God always seems to have, before it happens, opportunity. And we'll notice that again in Genesis. God says, look, I'm not going to give you the promised land yet because their time's not up. They still have opportunity. And opportunity, a way of escape, and the empowering of people to make a choice as to what their destiny will be.
And some of how you see judgment is naturally going to be influenced by your relationship with the judge. In that, if you don't have a relationship with the judge, this, random God coming in and acting is going to come across in a really different way to, having that relationship. Because, in this case, yes, God judged, but it wasn't that he was angry with people and just wiping them out. It was there has to be an end to this. This is too much. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the ways in which judgment is actually good news, rather than he's going to look and see all my screw-ups and I'm done for. It's that there has to be limits. Even from creation, you've got this, we've got the chaos and the darkness. The chaos and the darkness isn't gone, but there are limits.
And it's the act of a sad rather than a mad God.
Which I think is really important when we're looking at, trying to get that picture of God through a lot of these Old Testament stories, that if you have this image of a mad God, what you're going to see in the Old Testament is really, really different to if you're really paying attention to what God's emotions and feelings and interactions really are.
Mm. And so when we come to the end of the flood, God establishes this covenant between himself and the people. I'll be your God, you'll be my people. And that becomes the basis for the Abrahamic covenant, the covenant at Sinai, the new covenant. Bottom line, I will be your God and you will be my people.
And considering how much time, in this account is spent to setting up exactly what kind of God that is. Like, it's not he could say, Genesis 1, I will be your God. But he set up, this is the kind of God I am, and I will be your God.
And that's going to be reflected again. It's going to be reflected at the cross at Sinai. I'm the Lord your God who's brought you out of the land of slavery. These are the stories that these people needed to hear of a God who is wanting the best for them. And, of course, the flood solved all the earth's problems and they all lived happily ever after. Not. Because while the earth was changed, the human heart remained the same. And it's not long and we have Noah having way too much to drink.
And that never ends well.
and it doesn't end well. God tells them, I want you to go out, I want you to spread out and fill the earth.
So they clump up.
And so they all say, no, we're going to stay together. And there might be another flood. Now, what did God just say?
There will not be any more floods.
So what was it that got Adam and Eve into trouble?
As again, it's that trust.
They didn't trust what God said. God said, but we're not sure, so we're not going to take any chances. Let's build a tower that will reach up to heaven.
So that if the floods come again, we can sort of all run to the top and everything will be fine.
It's almost like that fig leaf syndrome of chapter 3, isn't it? That we can do something.
And once again, you know, there are a whole bunch of different narratives that are really quite similar to this. You know, some of the Babylonian ziggurats, there's at least one of them that sort of remained for a while, and one of the legends was really similar to this. You've got similar stories in Nepal, Botswana. Mexico has a very similar one where you've got it happening in Central America. You've got another one. There's a few of them that are associated with flood stories as well, that after a flood, they built this tower so the gods couldn't take them out again. But again, this reaction in the relationship of God, in a lot of cases, the gods were angry and like destroyed them or destroyed the tower, whereas God just, almost like a teacher in a classroom, like these kids are being really, really rowdy. And I could just punish them all, but what I'm actually going to do is I'm just going to separate them.
In the most creative way.
Yes. Like, you know, you don't have God raining thunderbolts down, whereas a lot of the other gods you either would or did in the stories, whereas you've got God just kind of going, let's just make it so that they can't talk and just kind of spread them out. Let's push them along a little.
And it's almost a little bit intriguing here. They have said, look, we're going to make a tower and it's going to reach right up to heaven. And the Lord came down to see the city because it was so small he couldn't see it from where he was.
Yes.
But then recognising if they put their mind to it, to do evil, and one of the blessings maybe is that the nations don't all speak the same language. And we have to learn to get on.
And there's kind of a degree of separation that, you know, if you've got some wild ideas coming from this one, it's not just sweeping through all of them. There's limitations. And yes, it doesn't mean those limitations are absolute. We can still learn languages. There are still communications. There were still trade routes and all that kind of thing happening.
And the day of Pentecost.
But just... like, again, you know, God's nudging them out to fill the earth. But you've got God just kind of almost enforcing the space, giving them space to you know, have to separate out and figure this out on their own, rather than sort of all banding together and coming to no good. And again, you know, in verse 4 there, they said, come, let us build a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens so that we may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the earth. So God kind of comes and scatters them over the face of the earth. Like, you know, it's not just, like there is the trust there, But there is also so we may make a name for ourselves and not sort of,
Again, it's all about
me.
the issues that were there before the flood come through again.
But you've almost got God kind of looking ahead and seeing, if we don't do anything, it's going to just get that bad again. So let's sort of put some measures in place so it doesn't get that bad.
Put some barriers, some boundaries, spread them out. And there's a list in chapter 10 of the different families and where they went and the nations that they became. Real nations that we can recognise today. There's nothing mythological in the language that's used in this account. But the ongoing issue. But in these stories, we've created the foundations for the rest of the Bible story.
Very much.
As God works patiently with people to help us to know God.
And you've got this picture of a God who is sort of, this is who I am, this is what I do, you are my people, this is what I will do for you. Like you've kind of got this multifaceted relationship with them that carries on through, but this is sort of setting all those foundations up. That I'm not like all the gods of the nations around you. I'm a different God and I relate to you in a different way.
And I'm not going to leave you alone while you suffer the effects of your poor choices.
He's not necessarily removing the effects of the poor choices, but he doesn't leave them alone there. Like even, just the basis of Exodus, which is what Genesis is essentially leading to. Like, yes, they are in slavery. They're still heard. God's still present. But he hasn't sort of, just removed all the obstacles from the path.
But he has to lead them step by step so that they can learn to believe in him, to trust him. And the rest of the stories that are going to go on, Abraham's going to have to learn to trust God. He has these moments.
And I think some of that process of learning to trust is actually the point. Whereas you've got, if you've got the other gods sort of, I am God, you'll have to obey me. Whereas God's kind of almost more like a teacher here. He's sort of just instead of giving you the answers, he's asking questions and just sort of gently stepping you through so you're learning and realising and building that trust rather than just kind of, I trust because I'm told to and I don't want to offend God.
He's giving people experience so they can learn that God can be trusted.
And stepping them through at their pace.
That God does what he says he'll do. God keeps his promises. And as we look at the stories, we suddenly realise we have a God who can be trusted. Exploring Genesis has been an interesting little journey, hasn't it?
Got some more to come next week too.
We have. So we hope that you'll be with us next week as we continue to explore some things that come out of the book of Genesis. But just taking what we've done today, we've looked at the story in the context of what was happening around them, the external context. When you're reading the Bible, sometimes you do have to ask yourself, what's the bigger context that's happening here?
Particularly in, but as you're looking at, say, some of the Pauline letters, that, the bigger context of what was happening tells you a little bit more about what he's addressing. And you get a much clearer idea of what he is trying to tell them than if you're just sort of seeing it in isolation.
There's so much to learn, isn't there? I've had my moments this week where I've said, oh, wow. And I've printed it all out and I've divided it up in a different way and I'm seeing it differently. I hope that in the week that's ahead, you might take it out and read it carefully. Read it for the picture of God that it gives. And find the trustworthy God that we have. Thank you for being with us this week as we've worked the Word again. We'd welcome you on the Facebook page, Working the Word. There's a link to it on the Lithgow, Oberon and Mudgee Church websites. And we do look forward to having you join with us as we explore Genesis Part 2 in next week's program.